Welcome, everyone. On the behalf of University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education, Perry Worldhouse, and South Asia Center, I welcome you all to our today's discussion on a topic that is close to the heart of millions, particularly in the ongoing circumstances. Our topic is right at the intersection of public policy, human rights, development, and economy. We'll be talking about education reforms in global context. We hope to foster dialogue among students, teachers, development practitioners, education managers, tech entrepreneurs, civil society organizations, and individuals from different professional backgrounds who are joining us today from across the globe. With millions of children out of school and dropping learning levels, education has faced a range of challenges pertaining to access, equity, quality of learning, and governance. COVID-19 has added another layer of complexity to the equation, and the solution to this lies not in isolated efforts, but rather a unified approach. For that, international organizations, governments, and research institutes are working hand in hand. We are fortunate today to have a distinguished panel of speakers with us from across the globe, leaders, policymakers, and researchers who are spearheading education reforms in different capacities, and I'll introduce our panel right now. Our panel is a blend of policymakers, development practitioners, and researchers. We have Alice Albright, CEO, Global Partnership for Education, with us today. We have Minister of Education, Punjab, Pakistan, Dr. Murad Ras. Dr. Murad, thank you for taking our time and joining us. We have Dr. Sharon Ravich, Professor of Practice at the University of Pennsylvania's Graduate School of Education. We have Edward Davis, Head of Afghanistan Reconstruction Trust Fund, FCDO. We have Jaime Saavedra, Global Director of Education at the World Bank. Thank you, Jaime. Robert Jenkins, the Global Chief of Education, Unicef. And we have Matt Brosser, Chief of Education at Unicef Office of Research. Thank you all for joining us and taking our time. Our discussion today, for our audience, our discussion today will be divided into two rounds. Round one will focus primarily on education reforms in general, the approaches that international organizations are taking to tackle the key challenges. While round two will talk about educational disruption caused due to COVID-19 and what can the world do better to resolve that challenge. Dr. Ravich will tie it together at the end with commentary on the need to engage in flux leadership and local research, contextualized research. And our last 15 minutes will be dedicated to Q&A. You can submit your questions, your comments, suggestions on the go, and we'll be scanning it and we'll try to loop in as many questions as we can. So without further delay, I would like to begin round one. Let's start with Global Partnership for Education. GPE is at the forefront of education reforms. It's spearheading education reforms with other development partners in, I think, over 70 countries across the globe. It's helping them strengthen their education systems and ensure the provision of quality education. And in the last 2 decades, these GPE member countries have witnessed 160 million more children in school. My question to you is, Alice, what is GPE's vision and what are the key challenges that it's focusing on? And how exactly is GPE trying to help these countries achieve the education objectives?
Oh, well, thank you, Usama. Let me just again make sure that everyone can hear me okay and see me okay. Okay, I'm getting thumbs up from everybody.
We can hear you perfectly fine, Alice.
Okay, good. It doesn't happen like that all the time, so I'm going to take that as a good start to a day. Anyway, it's wonderful to be here with all of you, and His Excellency the Minister from Punjab, from you as well, from far away. I have great memories of being up at UPenn at the Graduate School of Education. Now, I jumped on the Acela probably a couple of years ago, and Dan Wagner invited me up to give a talk, and I sort of fell in love with UPenn's School of Education, and I had a wonderful lunch with students, and I almost didn't leave because it was so much fun. But it was just great, and I'm very, very proud to say that my special assistant at the moment, Aditi Misra, who is here someplace virtually, comes from UPenn. And I said to her, make sure you tell Dan Wagner that you're here, and Dr. Ravich as well. So we're just delighted that Aditi is with us. So you've asked a question about reforms. And I think that, and it's also, I should say, wonderful, of course, to be here with all of many of the partners of GPE, between Rob and Jaime, Matt Brossard. We are all in this very much together. Let me just start on the question you've asked about reforms. I think that our approach to reforms is that reforms have to be lasting. They can't be a one-off. One of the tendencies that we have seen, if one was to generalize, in the approach to education over the past, is that it's been a somewhat fragmented approach, projectized, with lots of international money doing different things, but not necessarily coming together in a cohesive whole behind what government priorities and government intentions are. So GPE's overall approach is very much a systemic and systems-based one. What do we mean by that? It's the coming together of all the different parts of an education ecosystem behind government leadership that need to come together properly. This is the policy, this is the implementation, these are all the interests of all the partners, this is the views of all the civil society organizations, the teachers unions, bringing together all the money. And what GPE is about is trying to harness all of that, in addition to know-how, which I'll get to in a moment, and best practice, all to help governments deliver education better. We often get asked, why governments? Governments have the moral authority, the regulatory authority, the responsibility, the domestic financing capability to be the long-term, durable provider of education with a goal towards making it as equitably available as possible. There may be lots of other players involved, but governments have to take on the responsibility, and they do. And so that's what GPE is about, is helping governments deliver better. Now, getting to a second question, which is, how has GPE done this? You asked about the 160 million. We started out some years ago really developing the whole concept of working closely with governments around systemic reform. We're at the cusp right now of approving, hopefully it will happen next week, our next 5-year strategic plan. And it is another chapter in the story of how do we do this concept of systemic reform better. Education is challenging compared to a number of other sectors because it is so multifaceted. Our first strategic plan, or the first one that I was around for certainly, took sort of almost a one-size-fits-all approach to the question of education reform. With this next strategy, we're going to take a version 1 to a version 2. We're going to continue to remain very much focused on education reform, but we're going to dig down deeper on issues of inequity, of teachers, of quality, of how do we work in fragile and conflict-affected countries. There's a few very specific thematic areas. We're also going to really evolve our funding approach to it. And I'll tell you about our new finance campaign in just a moment. But in our existing strategic plan, which is about to come to an end, we had perhaps a bit of a one-size-fits-all approach to our work. Now we're going to take it to the next level and make it much more context-specific and nuanced, and figure out how all the different assets that GPE has as a platform can be brought together to help countries around reform. So those assets include a knowledge and innovation platform, which we have funded to $75 million, a local advocacy platform, which we funded to over $50 million, and a number of other different tools, also around different types of financing, all to come together in a context-specific way to help countries reform. So all told, this new approach is, or this evolved approach is a bit more nuanced. We're also spending a lot of time working on transactions costs and really reducing the cost of the lift. One of the, and this begins to maybe talk a little bit about the next topic, which is COVID. COVID, so the question you've asked, I think in some ways is, what is the relationship between education reform and COVID? COVID has brought an unprecedented set of challenges to education. It might be the most unprecedented challenge that the education community has ever faced. Certainly it is for the developing countries. 1.6 billion children were out of school, and the learning loss is going to be significant. So there's obviously significant risk to education that comes from COVID. It is also, though, an opening of a window or an opening of a door to begin to look at new ways of delivering education. And I'll talk about this a little bit more in the second round, but people are beginning to really look at new ways of distance learning, new ways of delivery, new ways of teacher training as a response to COVID. GPE has deployed $510 million to help countries with this. We can talk about that more later. But in a way, the moment that we have is one that may accelerate reform. And I think that it's an opportunity to work closely with countries to really understand what that's all about. Look at the evidence base. There's a lot of evidence that's beginning to accumulate around that. Look to see what the unfinished business is of the earlier SDG and MDG period around access, to see where children are still not being reached by education. But as awful as COVID is, it does give us an opportunity to relook at how education is delivered, not necessarily go sort of jumping into the deep end on EdTech, because it doesn't necessarily work everywhere, but this is an opportunity to leapfrog and rethink. And I think that schools like UPenn can play a particular role in helping to amass the evidence base around what works at a moment of leapfrogging. And I think that if you all were to want to pull together everyone in the education community and sort of ask that question, in particular asking the countries what works in this moment of leapfrogging, it would be a really, really interesting conversation. So this crisis is a crisis like no other. And it's one that gives us a chance to say, how do we do it better? Not just sort of a extracurricular chance, it is a requirement to ask that question, given what the stakes are. And so this is the mindset that GPE has in heading into our next strategic plan. We've just launched a $5 billion, that's the donor number, at least $5 billion campaign for our next 5 years. And the funding will be very much deployed around the whole question of reform and transformation. So this is very much top of mind for us as well. So let me stop there, and I'm happy to get into some examples and some more specifics about COVID and what we've done around COVID in the next session. But let me stop there. Thank you.
Thank you, Alex. That was very comprehensive. And I would like to bring in the Minister of Education, Punjab, right now, because I believe he has to leave for an official commitment in the next hour. Minister Murad is the Education Minister of Punjab, which is the largest province of Pakistan by size. And you can imagine the size of the province by the fact that there are 12.5 million, approximately 12.5 million children only in public schools and millions more in private schools. So my question to you, Mr. Murad, is that what are the key challenges that you have faced in your tenure in Punjab? And what's your strategy to resolve those challenges pertaining to education reforms?
First of all, hello, Sama, and hello to everyone. I hope everybody can hear me.
Absolutely fine.
Perfect. First of all, it's morning, I think, in most of the places. I'm running on the 14th hour straight today, right now, 14 hours. So if I'm not that cohesive right now, please do understand I still have to go to like 2 or 3 more television shows because we shut down the schools today all over the country because of COVID. So that's why it's a crazy day today for us. But to your question, Osama, extreme challenges we have faced. The number one challenge is the out of school children. And out of school children, what we did when we came 2.5 years ago, we started planning for all this. And the first thing we did was we saw that after grade 5, the dropout rate was at about 70%. And it is still close to that right now. What we did, we started, the reason for that dropout was because the 6th grade school, the elementary school, was not close by anywhere. And you have worked on that program, Osama. And you remember that we started, what we did was that the building that we used for the primary school, in the afternoon, we started schools there that they were converted into elementary schools. And the same teachers that were teaching in the morning started teaching in the afternoon, and 22,000 children came back to school within like 6 months, 22,000 plus. So it was a very successful plan. We were going to go ahead and open more in this past March, but what happened was obviously COVID happened, and then we could not continue, but we're hoping to open at least 800 to 900 more as the situation improves, hopefully in the next coming March. The second thing that we came up with was in our country, what it is when you have to open schools, you have to build a new school and things like that, what the previous regimes had done. So what I thought was that why don't we go with the model of private schools, that we rent the building and open schools, or rent the location, because with that we could have opened, I mean, if we go on building, it takes 2 to 3 years to build, minimum couple of years, and then it costs a lot of money, and we don't have that kind of money. So I'll just give you a small example. I had 200 million, and with 200 million rupees, not dollars or pounds, please, 200 million rupees, that would be around $1.5 million maybe. If I went on the previous, what the previous regimes were doing, I could only open like 5 schools, and it would take me 2 years. And I think if we go with my model that I came up with, where we are able to open 100 schools in 90 days. So that was also one of the things that we were going to start again last March, and we are still waiting. I mean, we were signing the leases right now. But still, again, we had to shut it down today. So we could not open, we cannot still open them, but we're hoping that this March we'll be able to do that. The last thing that I would like to say is technology. We have not used technology at all in the education department. The previous regimes have not. We are trying to make it as digitalized as possible. We're working on those things right now. And hopefully by the end of our term in the next 2.5 years, we can bring, my goal is to bring everything that has to do with the education system on the phone, either on your phone or your laptop or your iPad or anything that like that. We want to bring it to that. So those are just a couple of few things that we have done, but we have taken about 18 new initiatives that since we have come in the government, but these were just 2 or 3 that I wanted to let you know.
Thank you, Minister. And I guess my follow-up question would be taking advantage of the fact that we have leaders from different international organizations over here. From your experience, how do you think the international organizations and governments can work better and more effectively?
I think the most important thing, Osama, in this is that knowing what is really needed. What I've seen in the previous years before us is I think the target was something else and the money was spent somewhere else. I think it was the lack of the knowledge of the team here in the country, or not really putting everything in the right direction. So I think I think since we've been here, DFID has been great, UNICEF has been great, all the donor, World Bank has been great. So I mean, but the thing is to sit down and talk to them and exactly prioritize the things. The key is the priority. What is the priority? And then sitting down with them and sharing your plans with them, and letting them know exactly where the money is needed. Otherwise, I mean, a lot of money can go to waste, and it has in the past. So I think the most important thing is to know where to spend the money.
Thank you, and I would like to say that GPE in Punjab had like an inclusive process, which I believe it has across the globe, where
Absolutely.
it takes us through the process of sector analysis and sector planning, and then supporting the implementation of that sector plan. The need-based approach that you talk about, Minister, we see that with a lot of different international organizations as well. I'll move on to World Bank and UNICEF now. And as Minister Murad pointed out, that out-of-school children is a big challenge. And I guess for the last many decades, access to education has been at the center of reform efforts. But if you look at the quality of learning, that is a big challenge in itself. And as per a recent report, in 2018, nearly 90% of the primary school age children in low and middle income economies were enrolled in school. However, half of the children of primary school age in these countries are unable to read and understand text by age 10, a concept that World Bank calls learning poverty. So learning is a big challenge. And my question to Jaime is that from World Bank's perspective, considering that World Bank is among the largest financiers of education in the developing world with a current portfolio of $20.6 billion, is there a shift in World Bank's approach from focusing more on access to ensuring that the learning levels are being maintained and improved? What kind of shift have you seen in the last decade in World Bank's approach to education reforms?
Thank you very much, Osama. Let me mention a couple of things related to that, and also following up on some of the points that Minister Rapp was mentioning. And I was glad to be there about a year ago, and it's incredible how time flies. So great to see you again, Minister. So going to your question, Osama, I think it's both. I think during the last 20 years, maybe more of the attention was given to make sure that more kids are in school, and that has happened, right? I mean, enrollment rates in primary and secondary have gone up quickly. However, we still have about 250 million kids that should be enrolled in primary or secondary and are not. Right, and Pakistan is one country in which, I mean, that's a huge challenge. I mean, how to make sure that that we reduce the number of out-of-school children. But as you were saying, at the same time, even if we have done better in that job of bringing kids to school, many are in school and are not learning. I mean, the indicator that you mentioned, learning poverty, was before COVID. Before this talk would have been in January, I would already be saying we have a learning crisis, right? Because more than half of children in low and middle income countries are not learning the fundamentals, right? And if you don't, I mean, we use that indicator of learning poverty, meaning the percentage of 10-year-olds who cannot read and understand a text, not because we only care about reading, right? It's just one indicator that, first of all, is a right of all children, but then also it's a precondition for all the other critical outcomes that we care about in education, right? If you cannot read, it's very difficult, right? That math, science, social emotional skills, which are critical education outcomes, are going to be acquired. So, I think it's important to recognize that we are living a crisis. right? That the urgency of moving ahead in systemic reforms is extremely large. And that urgency is even worse now that we're living a crisis over a crisis, right? With the impacts that we're gonna talk later on COVID. Now, in terms of then how the World Bank approaches this and how to help and support and try to work with countries in trying to facilitate their work, I think, I mean, what we see is that there are 4 critical elements for any successful reform, right? One is the design of the reforms, which ends up being sometimes the easy part, right? It's not easy, but it ends up being easier than other elements, which is design. What is the right intervention that we need? And on that, one can obviously learn from other experiences, and other experience can always inspire, right, a minister in terms of what to do. But it's only that, it can only inspire, right, and learn what works and what doesn't work in other cases. But obviously what works in one place at a moment in time, it's unique, right? So design can be informed by evidence outside, but it's just that, it's informed and inspired. The second element is implementation, and having the right implementation capacity. We can have a fantastic design, right? However, I mean, education is a huge service that is provided to millions and millions of kids every day. So it's not about thinking in which way we can use technology and how to that can be implemented in a school. It's how can this be implemented in dozens of thousands of schools, right? By hundreds of thousands of teachers. So that implementation and that managerial capacity that is required is something that we try to continue working with governments. Third is political will, right? And as Alex was mentioning, I mean, maybe now COVID is opening, I mean, a window of opportunity, right, in which more countries see the urgency of many of the things that we need to do. But again, the political will is critical. You can have the design, you can have the implementation capacity, but you really need a leadership that is willing to take on many of the tough decisions that are required, for instance, regarding teachers' career, right, or how to select and how to deploy teachers. That's sometimes politically very difficult. But you need to have that political will. And finally is the funding. You need resources, right? But I think a key message for us here is that when we talk about funding, we're mostly talking about domestic resource mobilization, right? I mean, international organizations, of course, can help, right? And the numbers sometimes that one hears are big numbers, right? Just in the case of the World Bank, it's last year, I mean, our lending and grants to countries were about $5.3 billion. That's huge. This year will surpass another $6 billion. You say, well, that's huge. It's huge amounts of money. But if you put together everything that all international organizations put into education, right? And you compare that with how much is spent on education, right, by governments, all that international money is less than 2%, right? So for a huge countries, for instance, like Pakistan, and for many other countries, always international resources are small compared to the magnitude of the domestic money that it goes to education. So yes, through international resources, one can support, leverage, I mean, and help countries in their own efforts. But when we talk about how much more resources that we have to go to education, we are really talking about the social contracts in each country. That's what really, really matters, right? That each country really collects the domestic resources that are needed, right, in order to make sure that they can provide the right education to all students. So it's design, implementation, political will, funding. So all those elements are critical, right? And we try to tackle, and we can discuss a little bit more later, we tried as a bank to support in all those in all those instances, right? Particularly in design and in implementation and in funding. But actually, this is the homework is of the countries, right? And each country is finding, right, its own path. And our role as international organizations is just to support that path. But let me stop there. Thank you very much, Osama.
Thank you, Jaime. Thank you for the comprehensive answer. We'll move on to Unicef. Robert Jenkins, the Global Chief of Education of Unicef. And Robert, building on my question to Jaime, what is UNICEF's approach to education reform? And is there a programmatic shift from access to learning, trying to balance both?
Well, it's a great question, and I'm pleased to be here and take a stab at it. I'm just going to elaborate on my dear friends, Alice and Jaime. We work very, very closely together, the Global Partnership for Education, the World Bank, us here at Unicef. And honestly, I think we could each kind of just take each other's positions and just continue on. We are all such shared perspectives. And it's also it's a great pleasure to share a panel with Dr. Razin. We know we follow the situation in Pakistan very closely and support it, and are very much a key partner and appreciate our partnership, Minister. So thanks for taking time out of your busy schedule. So to the question, and I'll try and be very brief to enable others to also have some Q&As and discussion, but indeed, I think we have seen a significant shift in the last few years. You've mentioned tenure. I think actually the last 12 months with the impact of COVID-19, that process has changed, and pace of change and recognition of need for change has accelerated. And building on what both Alice and Jaime and the Minister has mentioned, I think, so why do we right now have an opportunity to continue to change even more and have practical implications on the ground? I think it is an growing recognition of the importance of education. I think everyone obviously knows theoretically and evidence-wise how important education is, but it was very emotional this last year. Children studying at home, children struggling to continue remote learning during this time. An appreciation of teachers grew enormously. I think also when we saw, and I think many governments saw some countries doing much better in terms of managing this challenge than others, there was also some lessons at the policy level that have accelerated the discussion. So with this appreciation, and now with the wherewithal to realize, I think, some of the changes with technology and with other tools at our disposal, as Alice and we often use the term that it's time for a leapfrog, jumping ahead to a modern education, something that's been long overdue. From the stats that you mentioned, Osama, lack of the percentage of children unable to read, the percentage of, even though many of them are in school, the percentage of children meeting these thresholds. So one big change, I think, is, I just want to throw on the table before passing over, is the shift toward a skill focus. So it is a focus on those learning outcomes from a skill lens. So what skills are we talking about? We have, as you've mentioned in the data, a laser focus on foundational literacy and numeracy, the transition between learning to read to reading to learn. In other words, being able to read is necessary at a certain stage of your learning pathway, around 10, 11, 12, to grab onto the other subjects. So that's a key transition point. We need a laser focus on enabling children to pass over that, to be able to read at that stage. And we're failing. We're failing up to 90% of children in Africa. We're failing 50% of children in low and middle income countries. So we need a new approach. The second skill set I want to focus in on is transferable skills, or sometimes called 21st century skills. So what are those? They're transferable in the sense of, regardless of what, in the end, what your job may be or how you want to participate in communities, these are skills that are useful. Problem solving, communication, creative thought, working with others, etc. So that's a key set. I think all countries, including in high-income countries, we would all recognize have failed children in acquiring those transferable skills. And now we have an incredible increased participation opportunity to zero in on enabling children children and youth acquire those skills. I want to flag digital skills. Obviously, we're all here on Zoom. I think we'd all recognize critical for all children and youth to have digital skills, all children and youth to have entrepreneurial skills. You know, you see these stats of how many jobs in the future are in existence today. It's millions of jobs will need to come alive or be created that don't exist today by entrepreneurs and by themselves and working for other entrepreneurs. An absolutely key component. So shifting to that skill focus will indeed enables us to adopt technology, new ways of thinking, more hybrid approaches to teaching and learning. I think far more agency provided to children themselves and youth to follow their dreams and multiple pathways to acquire these skills. So a far more dynamic way of thinking of learning and enabling learning to happen and acquire these skills. And I think we need to be honest. Those of us who worked in education for a long time, is our sector is not known for its kind of innovative, new, dynamic ways of thinking in general. And I think are now getting pulled to that, and or pushed or pulled, depending on how you look at it. And I think we do currently have a great opportunity to harness this increasing pace of change, and as Alice said, leapfrog it to the future. Thanks so much again. I look forward to the continued discussion.
Thank you, Robert. And in the next round, we'll be discussing more about distance learning and EdTech. I'll move on to Ed Davis. Ed, you have seen education-related challenges in Pakistan very closely. You have worked across the globe in different countries like Sierra Leone. You're right now sitting in Kabul, I believe. I guess let's start with FCDO's approach to education reforms, if there has been any shift after the merger of DFID. And from your experience working in countries across the globe in education reforms, what are some of the insights that you would like to share with us? And what are the priorities that international organizations and governments should be focusing on more in today's time?
Thanks, Osama. It's good to be working together again. But you and I both worked in Punjab. I think, first of all, it's great to be on a panel like this. I feel slightly an imposter, and I'd like to claim some of the dispensation that the Honourable Minister claimed. It's 9 o'clock here on the first day of the 2020 Afghan conference, which I've been at all day, and it's snowy and cold. So I may not be at my best, but I'll do my best to answer the question. Yes, rebranded as Foreign Common and Commonwealth and Development Office, formerly DFID. There is no change in terms of policy direction. It's fair to say, Osama. So the 2018 education policy that DFID launched is still valid. And it's a good example of the point that Rob's just made, the similarity between the major actors, international actors on the education front. The main focus of our education policy is tackling the learning crisis and tackling that crisis at its root. This startling statistic that although we've got 9 out of every 10 children in school, 400 million of those kids that are currently in primary school won't be reading when they leave. It is not good enough. The way that the FCDO will tackle that is investing in good teaching. So we're right alongside the GPE in that. The quality of teaching is the key. It's the most important factor. All the evidence points to it in terms of learning outcomes. It's also fundamentally political, as the Honourable Minister has pointed out as well. The second aspect is system reform. It's talked about a lot, system reform, but fundamentally it's providing the enabling factors that allow systems to operate more efficiently and more effectively. Punjab is a really good example of that in the way that it's highlighted through different governments what needs to be done to deliver better services that produce better outcomes for more children and consistently improving and expanding, which is no mean feat. The third area is targeting support. And that's targeting it where we feel the greatest need is. Targeting hard to reach girls, targeting children with disabilities, and again, same as GPE, targeting children who are affected by conflict. It's startling that here in Afghanistan, it's the worst place to be a child, with 3,000 children affected by the conflict every year, and their schooling interrupted. There's much to be done there. And the fourth area is being cross-cutting, not necessarily being too ideological about what we hitch our cart to, but looking at all the tools that are in the toolbox, working with every available opportunity. And again, Punjab and the work that the Honourable Minister is doing there is a really good example of that. Each problem that we face educationally needs a number of approaches. There isn't a single way to solve that. So that's our current, that's the policy that's been there since 2018. It still stands. I think the one thing to keep a lookout for in the coming months would be the UK really wanting to raise the ambition on girls in the coming months. It's something that's particularly close to the current Prime Minister's heart, and it's something that the UK has been leading on for a while and will hope to drive forward further. Second part of your question is what in my experience? I'm slightly unusual, I think, in my experience, that I started in the classroom in the UK, worked in local government, worked in government in developing countries, then worked for NGOs, then worked for donor agencies. So I've got this rather unusual multifaceted background. I think there are sort of 5 things, and I'll run through them quickly. It's already been mentioned, but we really do need to finish the job on access. Underneath that startling progress that we've had, 9 out of every 10 kids in school, there is huge inequality in access, both between countries and within countries. So in most developing countries, 1 out of every 2 children with disabilities is not in school, and that's not acceptable. Here in Afghanistan, we still have 7 million children out of school. So the job is not done, and we shouldn't leave the most vulnerable, the hardest to reach. We shouldn't leave them without the opportunity to go to school. Punjab, again, really good example of how to do that, how to expand the system and improve quality, using public-private partnerships, using innovation to open up new buildings. Really good examples, and a world leader from my perspective as a developing country in terms of special education and bringing children with disabilities into school. It's something I think Punjab should champion a little bit more, its success in that area. The second area, I think, is don't skip efficiency and jump straight into quality. The Honourable Minister has already pointed to the potential for resources to be wasted. There's 4 things that really drive me mad in terms of inefficiency, and that's low student attendance, low teacher attendance, schools not being open, and this is particularly pertinent and can't be helped at the moment during COVID, but in non-COVID times, schools not open for the number of days they should be. And then when they are open, when kids are there, where teachers are there, the time of the day in the day is not used as effectively as it could be. There's a huge opportunity to increase the efficiency of school operations, and often that's overlooked. So that's the second thing. Third thing is a phrase I've been trying to champion, and that's that the learning crisis is ultimately a teaching crisis. A system can't work better than the quality of its teachers and the quality of the teaching. There's ineffective teachers across many systems, sadly. Strikingly in Sierra Leone when I was there, which goes back 5-6 years, most science teachers in secondary schools scored less than 10% in the grade 8 leaving exam. We really need to work on improving the effectiveness of teaching. This can be done. We can scaffold teachers. We can invest in textbooks. We know how to do this. The other thing is having the data and the metrics at the right level. And this is important. We've got much better at producing data at system level. But without data at pupil and school level, we don't know where the good stuff is happening, and we don't know then what stuff we need to grow. So it's really important, therefore, that we have data and metrics at the right level. And then I think we need to use that to find those good schools, find those good teachers, find those brilliant leaders of schools, and transfer that good practice, grow those good institutions. London did this, interestingly, to use a developed example, in the early 2000s, rising from the bottom of the UK education league table to now being at the top. And that was simply looking at where the good schools are, where the good head teachers are, and what they're doing and transferring that. So that's sort of, getting teaching where it needs to be. And then finally is recruiting the best, not just the most. I mean, Pakistan's made real strides in using merit-based recruitment. As Andreas Schleicher said, he would rather have bigger class sizes and better teachers. The quality of teachers is probably more important than just the quantity. I shan't repeat what Rob said on foundational skills. Literacy and numeracy at all costs. That has to be the focus. Vietnam's done this. It's made leaps and strides in terms of learning outcomes by slimming down the curriculum. And then a really important point that Dr. Ras made, which I think is one that external actors like FCDO, but others need to bear in mind. We need to work with the politics. We need to work with political priorities, and we need to work with political goals. When there is alignment across development agencies, development actors, and the politics, then we get the progress, we get the political will to really create change. And when that change is quantifiable and leaders are accountable to it, we then start to get some real shifts. And we've seen that across different parts of Pakistan, we've seen that in Vietnam, we've seen that to a certain extent now in Sierra Leone, and hopefully shortly in Afghanistan. I'll stop there. I know I've spoken a lot, but happy to answer any questions people might have.
Well, thank you, Ed. And, I guess before going to Matt, because we really need to talk about evidence-based decision-making, I think I would go back to the Minister, because I know, Minister, you have to leave in a little bit. And today, I believe the government officially announced closing the schools. So talking about COVID and how the constantly evolving situation, and how are you adapting to the situation? What's your strategy to deal with COVID and the learning losses, the educational disruption that we face in times of COVID?
I cannot believe that. Jaime, good to see you and hear from you. I cannot believe it's been a year. Absolutely, you're right. I cannot believe myself it's been a year. But two things I want to say before that, Osama. One is one of the very important things that we have not done yet in our country is that we have not planned the education according to the jobs that are available. I think everybody wants to be either a doctor or an engineer, but majority of the students are it's not very clear in their mind. We're producing all these degrees and we don't know exactly what the job market is. It's not designed to exactly go with the job market. So that's one of a very big problem that we are dealing with. Second thing of inclusive education. I met with the president of the country last week, and we just started to work on the basic impairments that are the hearing, the visual, and the physically, like ramps and different things, so that we can bring these children into regular schools and not send them to special education and things like that. So we're starting to work on that, and hopefully we can do that within the next 12 months to 24 months and bring them, all these children, to regular schools. Now let's talk about COVID. COVID has been merciless. It has just taken a toll on us, especially closing down schools today. I was completely against that for the past few weeks, but the numbers that were given to me in the last 7 days, I have changed my complete mind on that, and we announced across the country today. The biggest challenge is now we did one thing. We condensed the syllabus and everything to make it into a smaller school year, because we started late, and then we thought that because maybe the second wave will come. It has come, and now the major problem is that the public schools, as I said before, is the problem of technology. We don't have an online system for 60,000 schools. That is 60,000 public schools and then 60,000 private schools. Out of the 60,000 private schools, maybe 15 or 20,000 have the online access. Again, we're looking at about 80, 85, 90% children without access to online schooling. For that, what I suggested today, and I've been working on for the past week to 10 days is, I think for the first time, we are going to give homework to children that is going to be graded so that the homework is taken seriously. Because most of the children, when they go on vacations, on these holidays or on this COVID time off that we're giving, they're not going to take education seriously at all. So what I have decided is we're going to put 50% of their promotional grade to the next grade. 50% of that grade will count on how they perform in the work that we give them for these days off. So I think this is the first time I think they'll take it seriously, because it'll depend on whether they are promoted to the next class or not. And 50% will depend on the MCQ exams that we are going to prepare for them. And we'll see how this all, because this is such a situation that it has taken everybody in us by surprise in the past 6 months, 8 months. And being in a third world country with very limited resources, we have to come up with the best things that we can for our children. Second of all, we have the TV channel that gives you educational lessons from 8 in the morning till 2 in the afternoon, but still that's not good enough. Our children are not used to being, even the ones that are getting online education in universities or colleges, they're not used to it. And you hear complaints all the time on my social media. They drive us crazy that they are not satisfied with it, because they're not used to it. I think that's one thing, is because it's the first time it is being done in a country like ours. And we are definitely facing problems with that. But let's see how things turn out. I mean, we're hoping we managed the first time pretty well. Good decisions were made. So hopefully we can pass this one as well.
Well, thank you, Minister Murad. And again,
and I do want to apologize if I leave early, because the media is driving me crazy all day, and still to be on TV and let them know where we are going with everything. So if I have to leave early, I apologize to everyone. But I mean, what a great meeting and everything. I really would like to stay. I'll try to stay as long as I can.
So thank you so much, Minister Murad. There are a bunch of questions that we are getting from students pertaining to you, but I'll cut them short, and whenever you have to leave, I'll ask one of the most interesting ones to you. So I'll park that for now. Right. I guess, Matt, we can move on to evidence-based decision-making. I picked up some key points from all our speakers, and they have talked about, Ed talked about targeted support. Jaime, you spoke about designing and implementation. Data utilization was another key area. And we all know that countries in the global south particularly have limited resources. Therefore, the programs need to be based on evidence. So Matt, as the Chief of Education at Office of Research, what kind of evidence is UNICEF generating? And do you see that evidence being integrated with policy and practice on ground? Or does it generally remain in the reports and research papers and never really translates into action on the field?
Thanks, Usama, for the invitation, and thanks for the great question. I'm delighted to be in this panel for discussing this topic so important for millions of children and their future life. Across the globe, thanks to the trust of our donors and the great work of about 900 education staff worldwide, UNICEF spends about $1.2 billion per year in education. It looks like a lot, but echoing what Jaime was saying, the total spending for education in low and middle income countries is actually 1,000 times more, around 1.2 trillion per year. So basically, the risk of sounding like repeating what other panelists said, the main focus of UNICEF education research is on government system strengthening, how to make the bulk of these resources that are mainly from government more effective for addressing the learning crisis. It is generated or commissioned by all our officers, including, of course, our country officers and including, of course, our dedicated research center in Oceanti in Florence, where I have the privilege to lead the education program. As an organization, UNICEF spends about $50 million per year on education research. At Innocenti, we have a growing portfolio in education with 20 qualitative and quantitative researchers who apply mixed methods across about 10 research programs in 40 plus countries. Our portfolio is very aligned with the UNICEF education strategy, Every Child Learns, and based on a consultation with our 7 regional offices in order to be really demand driven. In broad term, it focuses on learning and equity, in particular for the poorest and the most vulnerable, including children with disability, like others mentioned. Very consistently with what Alice or Minister Murad or other panelists said, we have 2 priorities in terms of research. Research on what works and research on how to scale up what works in a very contextualized way. Our research spans from teacher absenteeism to the equity in education public spending to digital and blended learning. Having been engaged in many countries in Ministry of Education sector planning and policy processes for the last 20 plus years, I believe more and more that the elephant in the room, echoing what other people said, is what I call the implementation gap. There is better and better sector plans, but where we still see gaps in terms of service delivery at the contact point between teachers and learner. In other words, reforms I think are very important, but the implementation of the reforms are even more important. So basically our portfolio is focusing a lot on implementation issues, including, for instance, researching on the positive deviant behaviors and practices that distinguish the schools performing better than others in the same context. And of course, we are actually aligned with the upcoming new GP strategic plan that Alice explained, with the idea to be very contextualized. Finally, I want to just raise a point, which is how we maximize the use of research by policymakers and implementers. And I believe the way we do research is done, the way research is done matters a lot in that regard. A few success factors based on our experience is: 1, building on what Minister Murad said, co-creation from the outset with government and beneficiaries, like not having pre-designed ideas of what we need to research on, but designing the research question with the governments, because they know better than us what is needed in each context. It's of course more challenging, and it's taking coordination as at another level, but it's the only way to make it demand driven and to change compared to the business as usual, more supply driven, donor driven approach that actually doesn't work in terms of research uptake. Second, embedding research as much as possible within programs and policies. There is more and more evidence, and when you include the research components within programs, you are more likely to have the research findings at the end of the day being used for both new reform or for better implementation of existing reforms. And finally, doing research more quickly. I mean, research doesn't have to take years to be done. If we use more and more the monitoring and evaluation routine data from program or from government EMIS, we can do research much faster than it has been done in the past, and it's what makes it more useful as well. So maybe I will stop here, Osama, and I'm happy to answer other questions later.
Sure, thank you so much, Matt. We'll jump into round 2, it's our round 2, as I mentioned before, for the attendees who are joining us now. Round 2 would be focused on COVID. And as per World Bank's recent report, over 693 million children are still impacted by school closures in 67 countries. 68th one would be Pakistan today, because it decided to close down its schools. And children who are not in schools are learning less. And for many, distance learning is not even an option. As per one of the stats, 71 countries have less than 50% of the population who has access to internet. So COVID-19 in a way has accentuated and worsened the learning crisis, particularly for the marginalized communities. So going on to GPE, Alice, my question to you is that has GPE adapted its strategy to deal with the challenge that education is facing in COVID-19 times? GPE primarily has sector analysis and sector planning process, but considering that this is it's an unprecedented situation in which we need flexibility in planning and programming, how's GPE dealing with this?
Thank you, Usama, for the question. Let me again just make sure everyone can hear me okay. Yes, that's a yes, okay. And it now seems like a long time ago, but around the second week in March, before the pandemic was declared a pandemic, we started looking at the figures and also thinking back about what we had learned about the impact that the Ebola crisis had on education, particularly for girls. We began to think this is going to be a major problem. So we looked across our windows and looked across how we work and presented to the board in various pieces what wound up being $508 million of emergency assistance to countries to help them contend with the impact of COVID. That window, which includes a planning piece, a $25 million piece to partners at Unicef, the World Bank, and UNESCO around global matters, but principally it includes a $475 million package of grants. All of that was designed and approved by our board between about March 29th and May 29th. And now the totality of that money has been allocated to country partners and also to global partners. So we moved very quickly in order to respond. And the reason why we did that was we thought that there was going to be a very swift closure of schools, which was going to have possibly long-lasting impacts on learning in all the countries that we work with, which wound up being the case. At the height of the closure, there were 1.6 billion children out of school. In terms of what we did specifically, we said to country partners that they could apply for grant funding for areas in which they thought they were going to encounter the most difficult challenges. And this very much links to what some of the others on the panel have said, which is that it's very important to listen to what partner countries want rather than having others from the outside impose. We then received 66 different applications. The main uses of the money have been distance learning, reopening schools, teacher training and adaptation, and specific funding to reach out to the most marginalized communities, particularly girls, to encourage them to go back to school. In terms of distance learning, and this is where we get some of the most frequent questions, there's always a question about to what extent are countries sort of very quickly adopting the most sophisticated and most sort of digital approaches to education. And the answer is that because of some of the connectivity and electricity and device availability challenges in many of the countries that GPE works with, countries have actually chosen mid and low tech approaches to distance learning rather than high tech. And that's because of the infrastructure challenges that I just mentioned. So we have seen countries provide a lot of requests for TV, radio, some paper-based distribution, forms of distance learning. And I think that the lesson there is that, yeah, we need to listen to countries and understand that they're going to be taking advantage of a wide variety of delivery mechanisms rather than just assuming that high tech is available everywhere. The other thing that we've learned is, and I think we've learned this both in the developing world as well as the developed world, is that if we are imagining a future where technology in whatever form can replace teachers, we're not thinking about it right. Because teachers we've now seen, again, that teachers play an absolutely vital role in the education process, whether or not it's on the hardcore content or more on the social emotional learning and environmental aspects, let's call it. Teachers are a vital part of the equation. One final point on evidence and learning, and this is something that we've woven into our COVID response in addition to our new strategic plan, is that evidence cannot remain sort of a faraway concept that is not informing the work that all of us are doing. So we've already launched an effort to study how the COVID grants are going to do, and I think that that's going to be a very revealing exercise to see what is actually the impact of these new approaches, and are there lessons to be learned for the future. In terms of our strategic plan, wider concept, we've developed a whole new approach to, it's called MEL, Monitoring, Evaluation, and Learning. And the idea there is to really form a much closer feedback loop between what are we seeing and what is it telling us, and what are we seeing and what is it telling us, and bringing in evidence on a much more real-time basis into what we're doing. And that will impact both our strategic plan as well as what we see on the COVID side. So let me stop there. There's a ton of information for those who want to get sort of look grant by grant by grant. There's a ton of information on our website about how all the COVID grants have been, what they've been used for. And I should publicly thank Ed Davis, because before he took on his current job, he was with GPE, and he was one of the people on our team who really helped develop our whole approach. So thank you, Ed. Thank you, Ed.
Thank you, Alice, for the insights. We'll move on to World Bank and Unicef now. And I guess we have talked about distance learning, the challenges pertaining to distance learning. So my question to both Jaime and Robert is framed around that very challenge. E-learning, we know that there's digital inequity in most of the countries, and e-learning can at times worsen the gap between different segments of society. So is e-learning really the solution, or should we look at a hybrid model? And also considering that we have a vaccine in pipeline, which hopefully in the next year or two would reach most parts of the world, hopefully. Should the donors be investing heavily in e-learning and EdTech? That's my first question. And my second question is pertaining to school closures. Is there a right or wrong answer or a correct approach whether the schools should or should not be closed? Because in Europe, there's a COVID hike. And despite that, most of the countries in Europe right now have schools open, while Pakistan has decided to close its schools today. So these are my two questions. We'll start with Jaime.
Sorry. I think you said two questions, but I think you had like 5 questions in your 30 seconds, Osama. So let me start by the following, and Rob and I have been talking a lot about this. How much should we continue supporting countries in their work in terms of EdTech and digital tools? But let me put this in the framework of the lessons from the pandemic. As Alice was already explaining, right? The countries have reacted to this huge and historic shock through basically multi-platform strategies. So everyone noticed that online was not enough. Online will be reaching 10% of kids in low-income countries and maybe 50% in middle-income countries. So definitely you had to then bring back education, education TV, radio, teachers using WhatsApp intensely in order to reach their students. So it has been really a multi-pronged approach. However, I want to bring back a concept that the minister of Punjab was mentioning, that we need to realize that despite all these efforts, learning losses are going to be big, right? We need to be conscious of that. So it's either because, I mean, countries were not used to this, they have implemented this very quickly, students are not used to this, we cannot really replay any multi-platform strategy, or even if we had a perfect, I mean, online reach for everyone, something that didn't happen even in the US. That will never replace completely presential education, and actually the learning losses are going to be big and unequal, right? So it's something that really we need to worry about. The calculations that we have now, the simulations actually, are that learning poverty, right, that we were talking at the beginning, that it's pre-crisis was 53%, might increase to 63%, right, because of the pandemic. And remember that learning poverty should be zero, right? Should be zero, the same way that hunger should be zero or extreme poverty should be zero. Learning poverty should be zero. All kids should be able to learn to read and understand a simple text by age 10. I mean, that's a relatively low bar, right? And so we're really dealing a crisis over a crisis, as we were saying before. But in terms of then what is that we can do in the very near future, right, in order to try to cope with this and to try to compensate? One is that definitely, yes, we need to close the digital divide. That's part of the homework. We have been talking for the last 20 years that there is a digital divide. Now, it was not closed. Hence, we're paying the consequences of that today. Today, technology, which could be the main equalizing factor, is actually today an unequalizing factor, right? Precisely because some kids, I mean, can have access to all the world that technology can bring, but many others are excluded, and the majority are excluded. So unfortunately, today, technology is an unequalizing factor, despite having the potential to be the opposite. So that digital divide has to be closed, and we're talking about the digital infrastructure of connectivity, devices, software, etc. We're talking about the human infrastructure, because teachers should be able to use technology, and it's a critical investment, but we need to continue to do it. And we need to have the institutional capacity, right? We're talking about data systems, technical systems, and to create a whole ecosystem that is needed in order to really be sure that technology can be used at the school and at the classroom level. So that's one lesson of the pandemic. The digital divide has to be closed. And the second lesson of the pandemic is that education is a social phenomenon. I mean, we knew that, now it's really clear. Education is about a social interaction between your peers and between the teacher. The magic of learning comes in that interaction between the teacher and the student. Can that happen through Zoom? Yes, it can, but it's not the same. So actually, we will be moving towards hybrid models, but we really need to understand that education is a social phenomenon, that the school is a critical space to equalize opportunities, and that we really need to continue investing not only in the teachers of the future, the teachers that will come to the profession, but in the teachers today. And it has to be a training that is really pragmatic, a training that supports a better interaction between the teacher and the student. So it's not about pedagogical theory, which is very important, but is actually in terms of the day-to-day interaction. How can that be improved, right? The teacher now is not a source of information anymore. The teacher is actually that coach, right? That person who can foster critical thinking, who can help the student when the student is demotivated, right? Who can guide the student in their own thinking process. And to close, and in just 1 minute, the other big lesson of the pandemic is that systems have to be resilient, right? There could be a monsoon in India, an earthquake in Pakistan, or an earthquake in Peru, in my country. So systems have to be resilient. And in general, we need to think of a continuity of the education process from the school to the home. That requires, first of all, well, connectivity will help, right? That's something that we need to work on. But we need to, in the same way that we need to improve conditions in all schools, because the school is the main equalizing factor, is the main instrument that countries have to equalize opportunities. At the same time, we need to equalize some of the opportunities at home, right? We need to make sure that at home, all kids have books in order to read. We need to make sure that at home, ideally, they will have connectivity. That will take some time, but we should move towards that. And we need to make sure also that parents, right, really internalize the critical role that they have in the education of their children. I think that's another lesson of the pandemic, right? But supporting parents, right, in order for them to be a critical element of the future of their children, I think is really important and should be part of public policy. That sometimes we forget. But though in using as part of public policy, having the idea that we need to improve conditions at home, right, in terms of supporting parents, in terms of connectivity, in terms of making sure that all kids, even poor kids, have reading material at home, is absolutely essential. So, so if we work on these lessons of the pandemic, we can really, right, use that window of opportunity that Alice was mentioning, that political window of opportunity to build more equitable and resilient systems. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you, Jaime. In the interest of time, I'll request the panelists to keep their answers to 3 minutes. Robert, we'll move on to you. EdTech, investment in EdTech, and school closures. 3 components, if you can share your thoughts on that.
Sure thing, Osama, and I'll keep to my 3 minutes, but with a point of order that I get to go first next time, Jaime, in our next panel, whenever that may be, because you take all our points together. But I think that basically, first of all, on EdTech, what we learned as part of the response to COVID was we need to use the full range of technology. I think when people think EdTech, they think of the one end of the continuum, IT-enabled, world-class. That's ultimately where we want to get to eventually. But we actually saw the amazing power of the radio, the television, but also even honestly delivering learning materials to homes when kids were learning from home. We saw in many countries, like for example, in South Africa, there was a hybrid model, leverage technology, blended learning, but also with IT-enabled, computer-enabled learning, but also the radio and television and delivering textbooks to home. So it was, while we recognize the digital divide that exists and the different assets and connectivity that different households have, I think we're going to continue to need multiple strategies inspired by reaching the most vulnerable and address those gaps. And so I think that's one of the key lessons from the last 12 months, and will continue. Let me just now zero in on opening up of schools. So the agencies across the UN and the World Bank and others have issued a framework for opening schools. It's worth Googling, and it helps to make this decision. Our advice is that to use that framework and recognize that it's context specific, and context does not necessarily mean a country. It may mean even a subnational level or even a community level, that context, because there's obviously factors that are very unique to each of those situations. And we would encourage schools to remain open or open during the opening process. So kind of be the front of the queue as societies are opening. So to avoid the situation in a sense where large parts of a society and economy are open and schools are closed. We think it should be schools should be prioritized and to stay open or open. And a second big message is to take all actions possible to mitigate the risks. And there's a whole wide range of actions that can be taken, and we've seen them all over the world. And there's lots of lessons also in that framework of great examples of how the risks can be mitigated. The last thing I'll mention, Osama, on this, and then I think I'm out of time, but is that, and when assessing the benefits and risks to opening schools, we do need to recognize it's far beyond learning. Those of us in education, of course, are absolutely focused on the importance of learning and reaching learning outcomes, but schools also provide enormous range of services, particularly beneficial for the most vulnerable. And I know, as we all know, school meals, critically important, psychosocial support and mental health, water and sanitation. But I just want to close with the issue of protection and how, I think the easiest way to describe this is schools provide a protective and shield to children. And indeed, with school closures, it increases protection risks, violence-related risks, sexual-based violence, etc. So when assessing closures and openings of schools, that full range of risks should be taken into consideration. But again, I encourage everyone to take a look at our website, the bank's website, GP's website, all of using these examples of what's happening at country level to mitigate the risks and innovatively keep kids learning during this challenging time. Thank you. Thanks again for this opportunity.
Thank you, Robert, for condensing the information within time. Ed, I'll move on to you next. And you have worked in Sierra Leone during the time of Ebola crisis. So any lessons that the world can learn from Ebola, and how relevant can Sierra Leone solutions be to other parts of the world?
Thanks, Osama, and thanks, Alice, for the shout out as well. I miss you guys in DC and the GPE family. I'll be brief, Osama, because you're short time. I think the lessons that have been learned from Sierra Leone work on two levels. One on the international level, and then one on the sort of more granular what to do level, if you like. And if there are any students out there who want to write a thesis on the sort of coming of age of the international education architecture, I think COVID-19 is the perfect point to do that, because the international response showed that when the multilateral agencies come together and when there's excellent leadership, which there was from GPE, from UNESCO, from the bank, from Unicef, then the impacts can be mitigated dramatically, and we can have a really significant impact. Because during the Ebola crisis, which has got probably more differences, quite frankly, at an international level than similarities to COVID-19, we did not prioritize education. Education was way down the list. But this time with COVID-19, because of the leadership of the multilateral agencies, it was right up there. And I think this is a product also of education in emergencies work that's been going on for a number of years now. But without the leadership of those four agencies, we wouldn't have responded in the way that we did, with the volume of support that we did, and with the evidence that we've marshaled. A couple of lessons, perhaps at the more granular level of what we've avoided, if you like. We got the continuity of learning programs up really quickly because of the multilateral leadership. We've taken, as far as we can, the safety of children and the well-being of children as a critical juncture as well. It's worth, and Jaime sort of pointed in this direction, I don't think we're even touching the tip of the iceberg as far as the impacts of COVID are going to be on children and on learning. Girls' secondary enrollment in Sierra Leone dropped 16 percentage points after a year of closure. So really, there are going to be some significant impacts. Incomes dropped by a third, and we know the intersection of poverty with a whole range of other factors has a dramatic impact on access to education. But there's one thing that I think we're doing differently this time, which is really important, and that's learning, documenting the learning, creating the repositories, creating the platforms, and building a resilience, as Rob mentioned, in a way that we haven't done in other crises or in other instances where there have been mass school closures. So I'm really optimistic and really grateful for the leadership that's been shown by the people on this. Thanks, Osama.
Thank you, Ed, for summarizing your response. I think we have approximately 6 minutes. Matt, I'll ask you for a quick response on the research, the rapid research that your group is conducting in times of COVID. And then I'll move on to Sharon to summarize the lessons and give us a closing statement. So Matt, on to you.
Thank you, Osama. I will try to be brief. A lot of research has been done with all our offices. We also, of course, the World Bank, UNESCO, WFP, and other partners, mainly using data and literature available from either previous school closure crises like Ebola, as mentioned before, Pakistan earthquake also, our survey data, and also new data collected during COVID. I won't name all of them, but just a few on parental engagement and link to learning outcomes, as building on what Jaime said, equitable remote learning solution and related promising practices, impact of school closure on learning on nutrition that was mentioned, or something that is, I think, very important, COVID and ECE, early childhood education. Pre-primary education is one of the most cost-effective sector, and it is so underfunded, even pre-COVID. And of course, with COVID, there is additional challenges with ECE compared to others. Examples of finding included estimates, global estimate on percentage and numbers of children being reached by the different solutions, hybrid models, or internet or TV, radio program, or take-home paper-based package. Actually, as mentioned by others, only a quarter, approximately 24% maximum of children could be reached by online learning based on basically what are the assets at home in terms of computer and internet connection. Of course, it leads to the policy implication you mentioned before. One, supporting significant increase in connectivity and reducing the digital divide, as mentioned by others. And two, in the meantime, let's not forget the most vulnerable children without internet or even without electricity. I mean, like Raime said, let's address also this COVID crisis as inequalizing factors. The key principle for making COVID research being used, I think, to be quick. Research is not like wine. It doesn't get better with age. It's quite the opposite. And quick research is even more important during COVID to be useful. And collaboration. I mean, it's almost 25 years I work in the sectors. And I think this unprecedented crisis led actually to an unprecedented collaboration. The joint survey designed both with the World Bank and UNESCO is a great example of that. Instead of having multiple data collection, overwhelming Ministry of Education with multiple uncoordinated data collection to fill, the fact we were able to work together in a very, very consensual and collaborative way was a huge change compared to the business as usual. And I think it's a key factor to keep on doing. And just maybe to end, I think the research on COVID is important for, let's say, three things. One, global advocacy for the risk regarding education budget cuts. And there is example of the joint survey mentioned, the joint report, what have we learned, but also the great work done by the Education Commission led by Gordon Brown with significant inputs from Unicef and other partners to the white paper for the Save Our Future campaign. And for multi-country research, the fact to have promising practices in all research, like showing good practices that countries could try to adapt in their context based on their availability or group of children availability of the different assets is actually an important thing. And finally, for country-specific research, I cannot emphasize more the importance of implementation research. At the end of the day, an IT tool is only an IT tool. If it is not done with the right pedagogy and taking into account the different contexts in terms of implementation, we will never be a game changer as we want to be. So maybe I will stop here, but really implementation research is so important that I wanted to emphasize it again. Over to you, Osama. Thank you.
Thank you, Mad. And indeed, the implementation research and its importance is evident, particularly in today's situation. Sharon, I would move on to you and thinking across all of this, what are the primary leadership and research lessons that we can gain from today's session?
First, I want to say thank you to all of our esteemed guests and His Excellency, the Minister of Punjab. I'll just be brief to give 4 quick framing or horizontal points across what everyone else has said. The first is, and a number of you have spoken to this from a variety of angles, the need for local assets-based research that is capacity building as it pursues the information. And an example would be the kinds of needs assessments we all do around the world. And I worked with the Tata Institute of Social Sciences to create a different model, a needs and resource assessment, to push in at the data gathering and training for data gathering, to push an assets-based versus a deficit-based, just entire frame to what local means, that it's not monolithic, and to how we engage in capacity building research. The second related to that is rapid cycle participatory research, to build on what Matt has shared. To touch on what a number of you have said, rapid cycle participatory research teaches entrepreneurship, it teaches technology and bridges the divide, it teaches leadership, and it teaches 21st century skills. And so I couldn't agree more with all of you, and particularly with Matt when he talks about the co-creation versus pre-design. And that's precisely what participatory research does. And the other piece is participatory research has been a tool in conflict impacted countries, and it's ready-made for this moment in the world. Third, a model that I've been working on, customized replication, which I see as a way to think about sustainable stakeholder-focused implementation and research and assessment of that implementation. And so customized replication are the ways we, replicate building up on our needs and resource assessments and on our localized research. And finally, I want to speak to Alice's framing at the beginning on the role of universities. And I appreciate, Alice, you beginning there, and I want to end us there. I believe, like you, that universities have a responsibility, an ethical responsibility on our moral arc of institutions of higher education who are agnostic politically across the world. And so I think that the role, Alice's question, which I think we should all leave with, is one that I think universities should be pursuing with fidelity and towards the building of an easily accessed repository. And that would be, what works in this moment of leapfrogging? So I leave us there. I would like the role of Penn GSE and the role of higher education institutions in general to be honest brokers in the ways that we can design research for what I think of as critical intersectional inclusivity. And that means something different in every location. So I thank you all. Thank you so much to the panelists. Thank you, Usama Mahmoud, for putting all of this together. Thank you to Penn GSE, to Dean Grossman, and I wish you all good health and wellness as we continue to move into difficult times. Thank you.
What a beautiful summary, Sharon. Thanks a lot.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Very much.
Thanks, everybody. Stay
Thank you all
well.
so much. Be well. Be
Bye.
well.
Nice to
Hope
see
to
you.
collaborate in the future.
Yes.
Be well.
Stay well. Thanks so
Bye-bye.
much.
Be well.
Bye-bye.
Be well. Take care, Alice. Be well, everyone. Edward, take care. I hope to talk to you. Jamie, thank you. Take care, everyone. Bye-bye.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye.